night last night and that this morning's rain didn't put you out too much. We uh, we figured that we would give you a couple of bad weather days so that you wouldn't feel too guilty about being in here all day locked up. So anyway, before we start today's morning session, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. We're going to put up at some point, perhaps during the first coffee break, on the screen the website or the link of the OAS press release regarding the event, so that and then there's a link to a gallery of pictures of the inaugural ceremony, and I'm sure that you will be able to use these for your reports and include some of the pictures and perhaps some of the quotes that are in that link on the Flickr. So that's one. Secondly, today, may I, Andrew? Thank you very much. We have an interesting morning session, as you can see. The first two speakers are here already. Mr. Barry Strock sitting to my right, and Captain Mike Brown sitting there over in the back. And we'll, I guess, move on from the logic of yesterday, which really dealt with perhaps setting the scene in generalities, sort of safety culture and so forth, to a lot more detail in today's presentation. Hang on a second. No, let's just take it. As you wish. We've been just sitting down, but there's a mic, and if you want to just walk around, we can do that too. Wait. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Here we go. All right, let me introduce today's speaker, Mr. Barry Stroch. Is that the right pronunciation? Strauch. Mr. Strauch is National Resource Specialist, Human Factors at the National Transportation Safety Board's Office of Marine Safety. From 2000 to 2003, he was the Assistant Director for Instruction of the NTSB Academy. From 95 to 2000, he was the Chief of the Human Performance Division of the NTSB's Office of Aviation Safety. He joined the Safety Board as a Human Performance Investigator in 1983 and became an investigator in charge of major aviation accident investigations in '86. In 1990, he became Deputy Chief of the Major Investigations Divisions in the Office of Aviation Safety before becoming Division Chief in that office in 1993. In 1992, Mr. Strauch also became the head of the program that trains the NTSB's aircraft accident investigators. Before joining the Safety Board, Mr. Strauch was in the faculty of the University of Louisville, where he taught psychology, and at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where he taught psychology and conducted human factors research in aviation. He was an adjunct faculty member in the psychology department of George Mason University and in the Aviation Safety and Security Certificate program at George Washington University. He is the author of the book Investigating Human Error, Incidents, Accidents, and Complex Systems, which was published by Ashgate Publishing in August 2002, and of numerous papers and presentations. He earned a BA in Psychology from New York University, a Master's in Science, and a PhD degrees in Educational Psychology from the Pennsylvania State University. Barry, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to thank OAS for inviting me to speak about the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB. As Jorge said, I have been with the NTSB for over 30 years, and I have investigated marine accidents, aviation accidents, and in fact accidents in all major transportation modes. I have been with the Office of Marine Safety doing marine accident investigations for the past 11 years. And so that tells you, by way of introduction, a little bit about the NTSB, that we investigate major accidents in all transportation modes, which includes aviation accidents, marine accidents, highway, pipeline, hazardous material, and railroad accidents. So if you may hear about us on television or read us in the newspapers, wonder why we're on a pipeline accident, well, that's just some of the types of transportation systems that we participate in. And this morning I'm going to talk about marine accident investigation. And let me start off by saying that the United States is probably unique in the Western Hemisphere, along with Canada, in that we have separated our investigation and regulatory functions into two different agencies. The National Transportation Safety Board investigates accidents. The Coast Guard is the regulator of marine safety in the United States, and the Coast Guard also investigates accidents. In aviation, we also are the lead civil aviation accident investigator. The Federal Aviation Administration regulates the system. Most countries, the regulator also investigates accidents. We have split up the regulatory role from the investigatory role, and I think we've done that because it's felt that that allows us to look at the role of the regulator as well as the role of the operator or the company or whoever in the system, and allows us to do that more objectively than would be the case if the regulator, in this case the Coast Guard, was investigating itself as part of its investigation. So next slide, please. So as I said, we investigate marine accidents that occur in the United States. We represent with the Coast Guard the United States in the investigation of U.S. flagged vessels overseas, or the investigation of overseas flagged vessels overseas if they have United States citizens on board as a substantially interested state. Next slide, please. We have two mandates in our legislation. In other words, we are required by law to do two things in our investigations. One is to determine probable cause, what caused the accident. And second, to make recommendations to prevent the accident from occurring again. Not all countries have that requirement. There are some countries like Australia, for example, which does not determine probable cause. They only determine major factors in an accident. But the United States determined that it was important to find out what caused the accident, and so by law we are obligated to do so. Incidentally, our reports of investigations are made available to the public through our website, ntsb.gov, and our meetings where we consider to adopt a report of probable cause are all made available through our website, through a webcast on our website. So we make everything we do available to the public, and we try to be as open as we can in our investigations. Now, I'm sure every country has certain rules that determine when they'll be involved in an investigation. You know, we don't want to waste resources on investigation doesn't have a lot of accident that doesn't have a lot of issues, for example. So could I have the next slide, please? So we will participate in an investigation where there's a collision where one of the vessels was operated by the United States government. What government agencies of the United States might operate vessels? Well, we have a Navy, operates a few vessels. We have a Coast Guard that operates vessels, and every so often, one of them is involved in a collision with a civilian vessel. In fact, most recently, an accident involving a Coast Guard vessel in a law enforcement function was involved in a collision with a civilian vessel in San Diego. I believe that was 2010 or 2011, and unfortunately a little boy was killed. That was an accident we investigated. Any catastrophic accident involving major loss of life will be involved. An example of that was in 2003, the Staten Island ferry collided with a pier and in such a way that I believe 11 people were killed. It was a very unfortunate accident, and we investigated that. An accident in which a recurring safety problem was evident. In other words, if we see an issue that has occurred repeatedly, then we will be involved in that investigation. So these are just some of the criteria that we use to determine whether or not we'll be involved in an investigation. Can I have the next slide, please? So if one of your flag vessels was involved in a major accident in United States waters, there's a pretty good chance that we would be involved in the investigation. Okay, so what exactly can we do in an investigation? We have certain rules that will enable us to do things and certain things that prohibit us from doing things. We cannot force somebody at gunpoint to tell us the truth. In fact, we don't carry guns. We can access wreckage. We can document the wreckage. We can access all records associated with a particular operation that was involved in an accident, and we can compel people to appear before us. Okay. Now, we can also secure records. In other words, we can prevent people, once there has been an accident, from trespassing on the wreckage. We can secure records and secure other evidence. We retrieve wreckage, we release wreckage, and as I said, we require witnesses to appear. Now, in this case, in the last bullet, requiring witnesses to appear, we don't have any rule that compels people once they appear to tell us what happened if they feel that telling us what happened could jeopardize their freedom from prosecution. Okay, so we cannot do that. The other thing, as part of this, is that in this case, the United States may be familiar with what's called a Freedom of Information Act rules. We are required to make available to the public all the information that we collect in an accident. Okay, so what that means for you as a flag state or as someone whose citizens may have been involved in an accident, if they're crew members, for example, if we interview them, we will make that interview available to the public. If they choose not to answer our questions, we cannot compel that, but we can compel them to appear before us. Okay? I hope you understand that distinction, and if you have questions, please. Yes, sir.
Good morning. I am aware that in the U.S. you have a number of layers. Sorry, I'm Anthony Ben from Barbados Port in Barbados. I'm aware in the U.S. you have a number of layers of investigation and layers of law enforcement. Now, I'm wondering if an accident happens. Suppose a plane crashes off New York. It's in U.S. waters. You're called in to do the investigation. Would you be doing an investigation, Coast Guard, local law enforcement simultaneously, or does one agency take the lead, and then when you're finished, people share so that there's no duplication of efforts and resources?
That's a good question. In general, one agency, a federal agency, takes the lead. Okay, and then what happens is that agency will likely share that information with other agencies, and we do that just to make the investigation more efficient, so that we don't have one person interviewed by 5 different people involved in an investigation. What it may also mean is that that person may be interviewed by 5 different people, but it'll be at one time. So we'll all be appearing together. Now, what you didn't ask, and what is what role does the prosecutor play in our investigations? And I think that was sort of underlying your question. And the prosecutor is not part of our investigation, but our evidence can be used by a prosecutor if the prosecutor so chooses.
Thank you. I was going to follow up by asking if, seeing that you are called in as a federal agency, if there's criminal liability, does it automatically mean that the FBI will take the lead, or would local, if it's in a New York area, with a local, the New York City Police or something, deal with that?
That's also a very good question. Thank you. The FBI generally is involved if there's national criminal issues, terrorism, for example. If there is suspicion of terrorism, the FBI will be involved. There's suspicion of explosives, the FBI will be involved. Now, let's say, for the sake of argument, that the local prosecutor decides, because people were hurt, that it's a criminal, possible criminal act, and there's a criminal investigation. Then, in that case, the local law enforcement agency would be involved. And I worked on one accident in Miami where a boiler exploded on a vessel, and several crew members were killed. And the Miami Police Department investigated that as a homicide. I believe they chose not to prosecute. I have also been involved in investigations where, and I'm sure you're aware, if you're not, I will tell you, if there is pollution involved in the United States waters, pollution is a criminal act. And polluters can be prosecuted. So if there is, for example, a collision involved with a vessel and a tanker, or a tanker grounds and fuel tanks are breached and fuel is spilled into the water, there's a good chance people are going to be prosecuted. And in that case, the prosecutor will defer to us to collect the evidence, and then the prosecutor will use our evidence that we have gathered and act on it. Okay. There are cases where prosecutors have some discretion. They could conceivably use our interviews and prosecute people for lying to us. Okay. We don't swear people in, but people can be prosecuted for lying to us. Also, the Coast Guard can take action against U.S. license holders against their licenses if there's violation of U.S. Coast Guard regulations.
My final question now is, I know you touched it briefly earlier in your presentation, but I was not too clear. Say like with the Malaysian flight that is missing, that has on U.S. nationals, do you wait for an invitation from the foreign country to come and assist, or because a U.S. national is on the vessel or the plane, do you automatically go in and say, we have a vested interest, so we're here?
Okay, the international rules are a little bit different than the international aviation rules, are a little bit different than the international maritime rules. Maritime rules, there is something called substantially interested states. If there are U.S. citizens on board, there's a flag state. In aviation, there's a state of manufacture of the airplane, state of certification of the airplane, state of operation of the airplane. The Malaysian flight, as you mentioned the Asian flight, I could tell you a little about our role in that, because the airplane was operated by Malaysian Airlines, which is certificated by the government of Malaysia. The pilots were Malaysian citizens. The procedures were all developed and approved by the government. Developed by the airline, approved by the government of Malaysia. But the airplane was certificated by the United States, and it was manufactured and designed in the United States. That gives us certain rights to participate in the investigation. So in that case, we would not need an invitation. The government of Malaysia, which would carry out the investigation if the airplane crashed in international waters, we would participate anyway. We would not need an invitation, but the government of Malaysia would carry out the investigation. Okay, so it's a little bit different in marine. I think and I'd like to answer more questions, but because we're running a little bit late, what I suggest is, why don't we defer questions till I'm done, and I'll actually talk about things other than just prosecution and the legal matters. I actually talk about investigations, which hopefully that's why you're here. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? So what we do is we collect evidence, and in this case we're unique also because, and I don't know how you all do it, but we work with the people directly involved in the operation collecting evidence. So if it's let's say the company is, United States Enterprises, their vessel was involved in the accident. We will work with people from the United States enterprises to collect the evidence, side by side. Now then what we'll do is we'll take all the evidence with, with everybody that participated in the investigation, and we'll analyze it ourselves. And then, as I said, we'll release the information to the public, and we'll release the final report to the public. Can I have the next question? Next slide, please. We call those other groups parties to our investigation. Okay, and to be a party to our investigation, you must be able to provide us technical expertise about the operation of the vessel. And we're a little bit different than the Coast Guard in this respect. The Coast Guard allows attorneys to participate in a hearing, let's say. We don't. Okay, so if people involved in an accident choose to hire an attorney, and many of them will, the Coast Guard, in a Coast Guard hearing, the attorneys can participate. If it's our hearing, we would not allow them to participate. Can I have the next slide? So what do parties do? As I said earlier, we can work with 5 different organizations in an investigation, and there'll be 5 different people interviewing one person all at one time. Those 5 people would be parties. They would be different parties. The Coast Guard, by law, is always a party to our investigation, and we work side by side with them. Others, as I said, may include the company, the vessel operator, manufacturers. We recently completed an investigation where the propulsion system was on a ferry was developed by a company in Norway called Skana Systems, and we went out to Norway and interviewed people, and we invited the Norwegian manufacturer to work with us as a party to our investigation. Can I have the next slide? So now what happens if it's a United States vessel operating in your waters and we participate? Well, in that case, any information that we take back with us is not subject to automatic release to the public as we would if it was our investigation. We allow the information to be held for 2 years. So that's so you in your country will not feel uncomfortable giving us that information if we need it. We could release it sooner if your investigator in charge, or IIC, authorizes us to do that. Now that doesn't preclude us from issuing recommendations if we think that recommendations are called for sooner than that. But we would not release information if your country does not allow for release of information before 2 years are up, unless you approve. Now, could I have the next slide, please? Now, one of the things about the NTSB is that this is all we do, is investigate accidents. And as a result of that, we have some unique expertise that most agencies, including the Coast Guard, would not have. We have our own metallurgical scientists. We have vehicle performance engineers, naval architects. We have 2 medical doctors, 1 medical doctor now and a second one to come on board soon and all they do is work with us in accident investigations. We have 2 fire scientists, and we have what I am, which is a human factors psychologist also, and working on all investigations. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk us through an NTSB investigation just to kind of illustrate what we do and how we did it, and actually I worked on this one. So can I have the next slide, please? This was the vessel involved in the accident. It was a tanker called the Eagle Atome. In case you're wondering, the word Atome, and I had to look this up, is a Japanese word that means young maiden. Okay, so now you know. And the Eagle Atome, I believe, was Malaysian flagged. I'm not certain of that. I think it was Asian flagged state, and it was involved in a collision with not 1 vessel but 2. It actually struck 1 vessel, bounced off it, and struck another vessel in a very narrow waterway outside of the. It was in Texas. I think it was the either Houston or Port Arthur ship channel, which is very narrow, and that part of the country has a lot of petrochemical plants. So there's a lot of oil tankers coming and going, and it really requires a lot of piloting skill to take these vessels in and out of the waterway. This accident occurred on, can I have the next slide, please? January 23rd, 2010. So it was a little over 4 years ago. There were 2 pilots on board, and they alternated. Okay, one was conning the vessel, the other rested. As I said, the vessel struck. The Eagle Atomi struck one vessel, bounced off it, and hit a second vessel. So it was actually 2 collisions in one accident, which is with 3 different vessels, which is really maybe a record. I don't know, but it's remarkable. Okay, I can tell you one thing. Probably, if you haven't asked, I'll tell you, the weather was clear. Okay, no fog. Secondly, and this is the case, I think, with many, if not most, collisions, in addition to the weather being clear, there was nothing wrong with the vessel. Okay, if there's nothing wrong with the vessel and the vessel collides, then what must have happened? There's only one thing that could have happened. There's nothing wrong with the vessel and it collides. Somebody did something wrong. It's only one of 2 things. Okay? So in this case, it was the pilot. He did something wrong. And what happened was he was on he had to make a turn. Big vessel, a lot of mass. And he started the turn a little bit too late and then overcompensated. And that, so after he did that, there was nothing he could have done to correct what was going to happen. That vessel was going to collide with an oncoming vessel, which is what happened. And then there was a vessel, I think it was docked, so it bounced off the vessel that's coming the other way and hit the vessel that docked. So we've answered the question, right? What caused the accident? The pilot made a mistake. Is there any more that we want to answer? And of course the answer is yes. Determining that somebody made a mistake is only the beginning. Again, we make recommendations. So what we really want to know is not who made the mistake, but why did the person make the mistake that he did. So let me show you something. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is the pilot's. Got the next slide, please. This is the pilot's schedule of activities. The accident again happened on January 23rd, so 1/23. And if you work backwards from 1/23 or January 23, you see that in the 2 days before the accident, his work and sleep schedule was directly the opposite to what he had been maintaining before that. Most people work in the day and sleep at night. And now I'm going to take off my investigator garb and become a human factor psychologist, okay, because I do both. And I could tell you that one of the things that happens when people are awake for a long period of time, and then they try to rest at a time when they are normally awake, they're not going to get much rest. And then if they work the next day, they're going to be fatigued. Now, when we talk about fatigue in an accident investigation, we don't mean the person's tired. There are some scientific correlates to fatigue. And this has been demonstrated repeatedly in the research. Somebody who is fatigued, their cognitive performance is degraded. Okay, now what do we mean by cognitive performance? If we think when we pilot a vessel, what we're doing is we're looking at the waterway, we're assessing the speed of the vessel, the current. There's an oncoming vessel, we're assessing how rapidly the 2 vessels will approach, how they will approach each other, how they will pass each other. And we have to make some decisions about what kind of helm orders to give. Each of those requirements are just the kind of cognitive skills that are degraded when someone is fatigued. Specifically, it's been shown that people who are fatigued, their reaction time slows down. Their ability to make decisions slows down. Their perceptual ability is degraded. What skills does a mariner need in a narrow waterway? He needs reaction time. He needs to make decisions. and he needs his perception. Those are the kind of cognitive skills that are degraded when someone is fatigued. So this person worked a schedule that was almost guaranteed to get him fatigued. He worked without rest for over 24 hours, and then the day before the accident tried to rest in a time when he was ordinarily awake. So we can say without a whole lot of doubt that he was tired. But as we say, you may see this on advertisements in the United States. Wait, there's more. Can I have the next slide, please? There are medical causes of fatigue as well. And one of those causes is something called sleep apnea. Now, sleep apnea in the is associated generally with obesity. And if you read about the United States and health issues, we are facing an obesity epidemic. And people who are obese, it doesn't make a difference in the United States or anywhere, risk certain complications from obesity. There's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of diabetes. There's also an increased risk of sleep apnea. Now, what happens in sleep apnea is when someone with sleep apnea is asleep, their muscles relax. In fact, everybody who's asleep, their muscles relax. Well, in this case, with sleep apnea, their muscles in their air pipe, their trachea, relax, the muscles at the back of the throat, and obstructs their airway. And what happens is while they're asleep, their oxygen levels go down, and they have to wake up in order to get oxygen. Except they don't realize that they're waking up. Their sleep is disrupted numerous times during the night, so that as a result, when they finally get up in the morning, they don't have a very good quality of sleep. Now, this person this pilot, it turns out, had what we call moderate sleep apnea. And the AHI 26.1 it's called the apnea-hypopnea index. It's a fancy way of saying the number of times he got up in 1 hour. It's 26 times in 1 hour. And when you get up in the morning, you didn't even know that you had gotten up at night. He was prescribed a machine, and the treatment for sleep apnea is very simple. It's like an engineer figured it out. All you do is you force air into the windpipe, and the pressure counteracts the muscle relaxation in the back of your throat. And that's called a CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure machine. You have to wear a mask, and you do that, you'll sleep fine. The one problem is sometimes it takes a while to get used to the mask. And this person did not use his mask, and we know that. He did not use it the night before the accident. And the Coast Guard form, medical evaluation form, didn't call for it. Didn't call for an indication of whether or not somebody was using a CPAP. It does now. But at the time of the accident, the Coast Guard form didn't require that the mariner reveal that. This mariner didn't, and the Coast Guard had no way of compelling the mariner to use a CPAP machine before the accident. So, could I have the next slide? So this mariner was not only fatigued by the schedule that he had worked, but he was also fatigued from the sleep apnea that was untreated. So he had a couple of things going for him that were guaranteed to produce fatigue. He had extended sleep loss within 48 hours before the accident. He had untreated sleep apnea, and he had disrupted circadian rhythms, is trying to sleep when he was awake. Now, the other thing that you look for if you suspect fatigue, could I have the next slide, is the errors that someone makes. Any number of reasons why somebody can make an error. But you know that fatigue caused the error if the errors were consistent with somebody who is fatigued. And it's exactly what we had here. By misjudging the initial turn, that's very consistent with a decrement or reduction in cognitive performance. So you look at other possible factors to explain why the person made the accident. Was he trained properly? Well, it turns out he was. Was he inexperienced? He was very experienced. He had been a pilot for years without any difficulties until this accident. Could I have the next slide, please? So and the slide after that, please. Next slide, please. Now, sleep apnea, again, is a medical condition that causes fatigue. It's associated with, but not limited to, obesity, it leads to, the other thing with sleep apnea, just for your information, untreated over years, sleep apnea will degrade your health. It'll lead to cardiovascular issues and increase the likelihood of strokes and heart attacks. So there actually are physiological side effects of untreated sleep apnea. Incidentally, ask your sleeping partners if you snore, okay? If you snore, then you may have sleep apnea. If you don't snore, you don't have it, okay? So that's, how do you know if you may have sleep apnea? Do you snore, and are you tired when you get up in the morning? You may want to be tested for it. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? So this is from a movie called National Lampoon's Vacation. A very pretty funny movie. And here's the family driving while fatigued. And I'm showing this slide just to show that that's not really what happens when you're fatigued. You're not out cold. Can I have the next slide, please? What you are is your performance is just a little bit degraded. Vigilance, selective attention means your ability to focus your attention on something. Reaction time is the ability to react to things, and your decision making. These are all the kinds of cognitive skills that are degraded with fatigue. Can I have the next slide, please? So these skills are particularly critical when a mariner is piloting a vessel in a narrow waterway or trying to do something, anything that requires cognitive ability, anything that requires thinking or perception. That could be piloting a vessel, trying to diagnose something, navigating in a narrow waterway, trying to avoid adverse weather. By contrast, if you make a major decision, like whether to buy a car or something, unless you make that decision in 2 minutes, that's not a factor there because you have time to evaluate it. So over time, it's a different kind of cognitive skill. Can I have the next slide? So being fatigued, it reduces your ability to monitor things. It limits your ability to make decisions. It slows your reaction time. In short, it increases the likelihood of an accident, either through collision, elision, or grounding. And thank you. This concludes my presentation. And can I have the next slide, please? This is my email address. If you wish to email me, if you have further questions about NTSB or human factors, I'm happy to, I'll be happy to answer them. And finally, the last slide. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much. While the audience thinks of questions, first, thank you very much for your presentation. And I do have some questions that perhaps would be of interest to the participants. First of all, you spoke about sleep apnea, which leads me to think that it is a factor in your investigation. I mean, otherwise you would have spoken about something else. But the fact that you referred to this sleep disorder in particular, and what is the percentage of accidents in which sleep apnea played a part? That's number one. Number two, if it's a significant part, does this play any role in the insurance of the vessels, in the limitations for the pilots? Do they have to get tested for it or not? And if all of these are yes, if there is a high percentage of sleep apnea, if there is a test, if there are limitations, and it includes insurance, why do they still pilot the boats and the ships? If I'm just playing a little devil's advocate here, but
Those are all good questions. Okay, so let me see if I could start appropriately. I don't know what percentage of people have sleep apnea. I've heard something like 10%. That sounds about right. But one of the things I've noticed is that when I come back to the United States from traveling abroad, I am really struck by how many people in the United States are obese. You don't see it as much overseas. It just is a fact of life. And the other thing is, if you travel within the United States, you'll see some parts of the country people are more obese than other parts. This accident occurred in a part of the country where there's a lot of obese people. Particularly in a place like Louisiana, where there's a major offshore maritime industry, and there are people there that have major weight issues. Having said that, I could tell you that since we don't know what percentage of accidents in general where fatigue or sleep apnea plays a part, because a lot of the investigations depend on the quality of the investigations. And that's why I said initially, it's not, you can't stop an investigation once you find out who made a mistake and what mistake happened. We feel it's important to find out why the mistake was made. Many investigations do stop at that, and so there are a lot of accident reports, I believe, where fatigue was a factor, but the reports don't indicate that because people didn't look for it. Okay, now, in terms of how dangerous is it to get on a vessel or enter the United States waterway because of all the obese pilots and mariners that we have here, it actually is not as bad as it sounds, because to the Coast Guard's credit, about 6-7 years ago, the Coast Guard revised substantially its medical oversight system of civilian mariners. Okay, and now all mariners are required to document all of their medical conditions and medications that they use. And we know that certain medications cause fatigue and certain medical conditions cause fatigue. And by the way, one person at least has gone to jail for falsifying his medical records to the Coast Guard. So that is a criminal offense. Now, if it's determined in the course of your medical evaluation that you have sleep apnea, then the Coast Guard requires you to use your CPAP machine before you report for duty. And I believe that most mariners are pretty honest about that. Part of the reason why they're honest about it is because one person went to jail for not being honest about it. And they know that that's what they risk if they are not forthcoming on their medical evaluation form. So I have confidence now in the Coast Guard's ability to deal with the medical causes of fatigue through their medical oversight system. I think the Coast Guard's done a real good job on that.
Thank you. Captain from the Inter-American Defense Board, then here on my left, and then Professor on the right. Thank you.
Buenos días, Capitán Javier Antunes, gracias por la presentación. Desde su punto de vista, o desde el punto de vista de la Agencia de Investigación de Accidentes, ¿es la fatiga resultado de cuestiones personales o del proceso laboral que pone a alguien a ser piloto de un buque cuando entra o sale de puerto?
It just depends. I don't know if we could make a general statement. We look at scheduling in every accident we work on to determine if the schedule affects fatigue. There have been cases where people beyond the schedule were fatigued because of personal reasons. Okay, but I think in general it's scheduling. And if you look at the hours of service rules, and IMO has recently upgraded the rest requirements under the STCW, the Manila Convention. That's an attempt by IMO to limit the scheduling effects on causing fatigue. So the answer is, I think it really depends. Depends on the organization, their jurisdiction, and what hours of service rules they have.
If I may, before the next question, I think I'd just like to make a comment. And that is that we were yesterday, Dr. Levinson from MIT, who was here, and you know, she was very adamant and very emphatic about the fact that when you identified a root cause, that's actually the result of some other process that takes you to that root cause. And another thing I think that I at least learned last night is that you can plan for any number of contingencies. Like you say, you know, the schedule, we'll get the pilot, the captain of the schedule, and we'll make sure that he uses his apparatus when he needs to go to sleep. But there's always the unforeseen, always the unsuspected, the unexpected. Whereas perhaps there was an accident of someone else on the boat that the captain had to be up in the middle of the night to deal with, and that influenced the whole thing. So at the end of the day, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen and to plan for every contingency. And yeah, anyway, that's what I took from yesterday. So your job is definitely not easier. We had a question here on the left.
Alexander from St. Lucia. My question, the general officer across there basically brought my concerns in terms of, I think most times as investigators, the emphasis is in terms of putting the blame or liability on the captain of the vessel. And I think sometimes, I think the owners as well, because of scheduling conflicts or wanting to maximize profits, they actually put additional burdens on the captains or the boat masters on those vessels to probably go against the rest periods. So I think, like you mentioned, in terms of the Manila Convention, I think that addresses that concern as well. But I think commercial profits vis-a-vis the fatigue, there's always that conflict between wanting to maximizing your profits and putting the actual vessel and the crew and passengers at risk. So I think that's one area I think investigators have to be very, very aware of all the time.
That's also a very good point. I think we have to be realistic as government officials that making a profit is not a bad thing. Companies are in business to make a profit. If they don't make a profit, people won't be working. They'll be out of business. And there's been a lot written about the role of the desire to make a profit versus the desire for safety. Good companies, I think, can do both, make a profit and operate safely. So anyway, so I don't want to disparage the importance of making a profit. I have seen personally companies that cut a lot of corners making a profit, and other companies that didn't. I've seen companies put mariners on a vessel together, they've never worked together before, and had one person out there teach them while they're sailing, instructing them on the SMS while they're working, and it was clear this company was cutting every corner they possibly could within the rules. The other thing I'll say is, and I didn't hear what Dr. Levinson said, but I've read enough of her work to know what, how she thinks, and I think that, life isn't always clean. When you have children, you have certain, in the back of your mind, you have certain goals. You want them to lead a certain life, but you can't control everything, and things happen that you can't control. In the marine environment, how well we deal with those things that we can't control is a product of training, the company's role in fostering safety, in the maintenance of the equipment. So I guess what I want to say is that we deal with things we can't control and their interactions with life in a safe environment by doing what we know reduces the risk of accidents. And one of them is getting a good night's sleep. One of them is scheduling people so that they can rest sufficiently, providing good equipment, providing adequate training so that people can respond safely to emergencies.
Sí, buenos días. El profesor Hugo Sergio Gómez de la Universidad del Noroeste en Tampico. Usted mencionó hace un momento la cuestión flexible para la obtención de la información en algunos casos, pero en el caso de Macondo, de la BP, se condenó a una persona por la destrucción de información. ¿Cuándo se convierte el caso de Macondo en un caso criminal? ¿Cuando pasa de una esfera de la investigación a otra? ¿Cuando ya esto es castigable?
I'm not sure I could really answer that because we don't make those decisions. The prosecutor makes the decisions. But I could tell you if there's pollution, significant pollution, the prosecutors will be looking, if there's loss of life, they're going to be looking. It's their decision whether or not to prosecute, not ours. So that's why I can't really say. But again, pollution, loss of life, there's a pretty good chance that the prosecutors will be interested and will make a determination whether to prosecute.
Okay, my question basically is that as we're aware, especially as it relates to aviation, there's a lot of oversight, and a number of things happen, and in terms of regulation and governing that aspect. In relation to the maritime sector, there is usually a deficiency, as you talked about issues like apnea and so on, whether in terms of the NTSB, because you don't only investigate within your borders, depending, as you explained earlier, you may have to investigate outside of your normal areas for several of the reasons you stated before. However, like we said, that if in relation to safety, a problem or a root cause is identified, then that should be taken, and that problem to avoid future problems. And I speak, I'm from Dominica, I speak from the region in relation to the Caribbean area. And in terms of the level of oversight as it relates to, say, having medical practitioners in terms of a body that would be able to execute or to make recommendations, and prior to a problem, whether or not the NTSB, for example, offers that kind of assistance to be able to assist the countries to develop a cadre of persons that would be able to lend itself to oversight so that to avoid the problem from taking place, where in countries, especially, for example, in the region, you have large volumes of persons holidaying or vacationing in the Caribbean, either through cruise ships and so on, whether that can be done, because that obviously is a problem that needs to be addressed and not only found out after the investigation.
I think the answer is we'd be happy to do that within, to the extent that we can. We would work, I assume, with the Maritime Administration, with the Coast Guard, with the State Department, but we'd be happy to do that. I know we have at the request of other governments, gone overseas and conducted training classes overseas. We'd be happy, if we would make recommendations when we felt an investigation warranted recommendations. But in terms of working with a host government on safety issues, I think we'd be happy to do that.
Great. Well, thank you, Barry, for this presentation. I think
one
it's been very
question.
informative. Oh.
Yeah, one question.
Do we have time for one more?
Well, we're running a little late. Should we
Well,
make
I
it
think-
too quick and easy?
Yeah, I just want to know, Dr. Barry, one,
Go ahead.
do you have a prescribed methodology by which you conduct the investigation, or is it based upon the unique context, the cultural or the geographical context that determine the extent to which a particular methodology would be applied?
We have a methodology, and we go through the steps irrespective of the context. It's not written down, and I guess the analogy would be, if you go to a doctor because you have a complaint, he or she goes through a process that's not written down. They just do it because of as a result of their experience and their training. But basically, what we do is we have different specialties that will go out to an investigation, depending on the circumstances of the investigation. In almost all cases, we will send out at least one person who's a bridge specialist, in other words, a specialist in navigation, and one person who's an engineer. I'll go out if it looks like there's human error involved. If there are issues with the VDR, or voyage data recorder, we'll send out a VDR specialist. If there are any medical issues, we'll send out, we won't send out our medical doctor, but we'll bring the information back to the doctor to look at. If there's a fire on board, there's a pretty good chance we'll send a fire scientist. So the protocol is really a function of the circumstances of the accident that will dictate which specialists we go down, we'll send down to the on-site.
Okay, Michael Jenkins from Belize. Taking into consideration that we are not aware of the amount of times we wake up during the course of the night, I believe that most people will be in denial of sleep apnea. Is it taken into consideration that the CPAP would be mandatory to be recorded and taken on board a ship depending on the length of the vessel?
Yeah, I think the Coast Guard requires the people who have diagnosed sleep apnea to take the CPAP with them. CPAPs also have little circuits that record CPAP use, and the Coast Guard, I believe, requires that they be read out before each medical examination to make sure that the pilot has demonstrated that he or she, the mariner has demonstrated that he or she has used the CPAP before being on duty. By the way, if you have any suspicion whether somebody has sleep apnea, just ask them if they snore. And we don't have the authority to regulate, but we can ask the Coast Guard to require somebody go to a sleep clinic to be tested for sleep apnea, and that's the only way to know if you have it. Is you go to a clinic and they wire you up and they see how you sleep.
All right, thank you very much. I think you wanted to, no, please go ahead. Continue. Yeah, wanted to ask him something.
Sure. Just wanted to thank you, Barry, for the informative presentation and a very informative Q&A. Other speakers yesterday, and you've really expanded on a discussion of human factors information. We're wondering if you could point us in the direction of resources that maybe we can make available on our website, because this seems like a topic that we have a lot of interest in, even if it's just publicly available information, not on government sites, but on other reputable. This has been one of the more informative and engaging topics.
That's the best one. There are human factors texts, but there are not many human factors texts for the marine environment. And the thing with human factors texts is a lot of times they'll focus on one or two issues of human factors interest: automation, controlled design, the ergonomics of a console. There's been a lot written about fatigue in journals, and there's been a lot written on safety culture. I understand you talked about that yesterday. A lot of what's written, I don't find all that helpful. But there are some textbooks out there that I think are good, and I could probably recommend some to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a small,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. And now I'd like to welcome up here at the table my good friend Captain Mike Brown, and I'll tell you who we're going to listen to while they load up his presentation. Captain retired Mike Brown of the United States Coast Guard is the Chief of International Port Security Program. He was on active duty in the Coast Guard for 30 years and has had a variety of assignments in port safety and port security. He was the captain of the port in Pittsburgh and Chicago and taught at the National Defense University. He has been with the International Port Security Program since 2003, and he has a bachelor's degree from the United States Coast Guard Academy and a master's degree from Long Beach State University and the National Defense University. Mike, welcome.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I see some familiar faces. I was looking at the agenda, and I'm in a very unenviable spot. The only thing between you and a break is me. So I better be funny, I better be fast, or I better be good. I'll try to be fast. Now, you'll notice on the agenda that I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different than what the agenda called for, but I think the topic that I want to talk about, what the Coast Guard's approach to safety and security, is kind of an overarching general topic, and to kind of give you a sense of how we in the Coast Guard approach our statutory mandate as the primary maritime safety and security agency in the United States. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, I'm from the International Port Security Program, and I know this is largely about safety, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our program very briefly. For those of you who don't know, the International Port Security Program goes to ports and countries throughout the world and engages in discussions with our trading partners, our counterparts, something called the designated authority or the organization responsible for security, to try to share and align best security practices, to share ideas, to share experiences. Now, the one thing I do want to say is the last bullet there. While our program primarily focuses on security, we have found that safety and security are really two sides of the same coin. If we go to a facility, go to a port, and find that they have good safety procedures in place, in general, you're going to find that their security is very good as well. Safety and security, as much as they are technical aspects, they are a cultural aspect. A safety and security culture, a recognition of the importance of safety and security, are what are critical in having a safe and secure environment. And we find that that culture transcends safety and security. It's intermingled. If you're doing things safely, you're probably also doing things securely, and vice versa, because it is an attitude and a mindset. And I think I would just like to follow on what my previous colleague talked about profit and companies making a profit. Safety and security can be looked at as a cost, or they can be looked at as an investment. If you look at it as an investment, yes, you are paying some money up front or paying some resources up front, but what you benefit, what you gain from reduced accidents, reduced likelihood of damage or death or destruction, your company's reputation, the things that you gain outweigh the costs that you pay. So if you look at it from an investment standpoint as opposed to just a cost standpoint, it might help your decision making. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, we use something called, or a concept called, maritime governance, which is really a systems approach to what we do. Let's have the next slide. Maritime governance, as you can see from this cube here, is a group of various elements that put together give you an overall system that is safe and secure. When you look at the top of the cube, you'll see three items. You'll see safety, security, and stewardship. Safety is protection from accidents. Security is protection from deliberate acts. And stewardship is protecting the environment. In order to fulfill our responsibilities, Coast Guard looks at regimes, awareness, and operations, and we look at a unity of effort between the government, the private sector, and indeed the international community. Now, The Coast Guard is somewhat unique throughout the world in that we have responsibility and authority for the wide range of activities you see across the top of the cube. We're responsible for marine safety, for maritime security, and for maritime stewardship. That's important because we get synergies. Things that you do to support security will also support safety. Things that you do to support prevention of pollution will also support safety. And the converse is also true. Let's have the next slide. Now, maritime governance means using all of the institutions, your structures of authority, the ability to compel compliance, capabilities that you as a nation have to oversee maritime activities in your maritime space, in the adjacent maritime space, that is, in international waters that are immediately adjacent to your country, to protect and to ensure and to facilitate your national maritime interests. Let's have the next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, three elements of maritime governance: authority or regimes, situational awareness, operations. And we're going to talk about all three of these in a little bit more detail in just a second. Authority or regimes means the legal ability to do something. Maritime situational awareness means knowing what's going on so you know where to do things, and operations are doing things. Let's have the next slide. Okay, let's take a look at the first element of regimes or authorities. Next slide. Now, authority or regimes are rules, requirements. They say what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in the maritime domain. They represent a framework of the Maritime Safety Agency, in our case is the Coast Guard, can conduct operations and can ensure that its statutory mandate, its lawful requirements are being met. Let's go back 2 slides. One more. Go ahead one. Okay. Now you see regimes, you see international, private, and government. Okay? There are international regimes. There are international safety, international security, international pollution requirements, and there are government regimes. Every country, or most countries, have a series of laws, of domestic laws, that require or prohibit certain activities. And the private sector is responsible for obeying those laws. So you have an international, a government, and a private sector role in the regime piece. Let's take a look at what we do in the United States. Can we go ahead 2 slides, I think? Here are some of the authorities that we have in the United States. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it kind of shows you a sense of the statutory basis for much of what we do. The Coast Guard was actually formed back in the early 1900s. We had several other organizations that preceded the Coast Guard before we became the Coast Guard. But in 1917, the first set of regulations from the Espionage Act that talked about security, but it was also a safety component too. in 1940, concerned about the safety of various kinds of dangerous cargo. Cargo was blowing up. Cargo was catching on fire. What can we do about that? In 1950, again, another security-related act, but it also had some safety components to it. I think our major safety regulation, safety law, was the Ports and Waterways Safety Act of 1972, which gave us a great deal of authority to conduct various kinds of safety inspections, pose various kinds of safety requirements, required various things from vessels and for facilities to maintain a safe environment. Let's have the next slide. In 1978, the Port and Tanker Safety Act, which was largely in response to a rash of tanker accidents that happened in the mid and late 1970s, required tankers now to maintain certain primarily safety requirements to ensure that they wouldn't pollute and, more importantly, they wouldn't have explosions or blow up. The International Maritime and Port Security Act was in response to some cruise ship accidents and some cruise ship security incidents, so required the Coast Guard and the State Department to look at cruise ship terminals and cruise ship facilities to ensure that they were secure and safe. After 9/11, the Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002, the MTSA, that was the act that actually established the International Port Security Program. But it looked at primarily security regimes in throughout the world and required security measures in the United States. And then our most recent one is the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, which looks at cruise ships and primarily law enforcement, protection of passengers aboard cruise ships. There have been a rash of mysterious disappearances, a rash of sexual assaults on board cruise ships, and the Cruise Ship Security and Safety Act requires cruise lines and vessels to take measures to try to prevent those type of things from occurring. The important thing here is, let's go to the next slide, is that in the United States, we have national and local responsibilities for safety and security that are on the part of the Coast Guard. Nationally, we issue nationwide regulations. Locally, we have individuals called captains of the port that are in each port area that enforce those regulations. You may have heard that in my bio that I was captain of the port in Pittsburgh and captain of the port in Chicago. So in that role, I was responsible for enforcing safety requirements, security requirements, marine environmental protection requirements in the area of responsibility. On the inland waterway system in Pittsburgh and on the Great Lakes region around Chicago when I was at the Marine Safety Office in Chicago. As a captain of the port, you have broad authorities to take actions to ensure safety and security within a port, as well as environmental protection. You're responsible for the facilities that operate in the port, the vessels that operate in the port, and on the U.S. side, and foreign flag vessels that operate in the port as well. For U.S. flag vessels, we have more authority. We are the ones that certificate them. We're the ones that ensure that they meet their safety and security requirements. And for international vessels, we ensure that they meet international standards. One very important factor that I'd like to call your attention to is interagency cooperation. In the United States, while the Coast Guard has the primary responsibility for safety and security, we share that responsibility with other organizations, at least in part. So coordinating our activities with the interagency, with other agencies that have similar responsibilities, is important to ensure that there are any gaps. You heard in our previous speaker, should there be a major casualty, the Coast Guard in a maritime environment has responsibilities to investigate that casualty. The National Transportation Safety Board also has responsibilities to investigate that casualty. And so we work together in order to try to get to the root cause and get to the bottom of what happened, because we both have the same goal of preventing future casualties. We have relationships with other organizations as well, such as our Customs and Border Protection, our Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with local law enforcement, with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, an organization that's responsible, should there be some sort of major catastrophe or disaster, helping to respond to that disaster. We also have something called port security committees, harbor safety committees, and area committees. Now, these are interagency and private public sector groups that work together to coordinate activities, to share information, to resolve conflicts, to try to be sure that all parties are working towards the same goal. Let me have the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the next awareness in a minute, but again, if you look on the side of the chart, of the cube, you'll see international, private, and government. Well, from a private and a government standpoint, these interagency, these harbor safety, these area committees, these port security committees are all public-private partnerships. Now, in general, the Coast Guard chairs the committee, but it's made up of other government agencies with equities, and it's also made up of private sector individuals. So, shipping companies, stevedoring firms, the Port Authority, labor unions, all of the people who have an interest and have a stake in a safe, secure, and environmentally clean area have seats at the table. Each one of the committees that I mentioned, the area committee focuses on the pollution, the harbor safety committee focuses on safety, the port security committee focuses on security. We also, when it comes to these committees, do this on both a national level and a local level. So we have national committees that look at national level issues with national level stakeholders, and then each individual port or port area will have its local committees. And that's one of the things that we've seen in, and one of the things that we always recommend when we go and we visit foreign countries. Some countries do have these local committees, many countries don't. And we think that having these kind of committees really does improve safety, security, and stewardship in your country. Because by working together and having all of the relevant stakeholders in the same place and the same time, you're better able to resolve conflicts, to get everyone looking at a problem in the same way, and having everyone working together and not against one another to try to resolve the problem. So we're going to talk about awareness now, knowing what's going on. Let's have the next slide. Now, we have something called maritime domain awareness. What's the maritime domain? Well, It's all things, all areas that are in the maritime environment. And we take a very broad view of the maritime environment. So we're thinking about on the water, under the water, adjacent to the water, U.S. waters, international waters that are the approaches to U.S. waters. Situational awareness means, okay, given that you have this maritime environment, do you know what's going on in that maritime environment? And can you ensure that you can take action, you have the awareness to be able to take action should there be a problem? Let's have the next slide. Now, here are some of the things that we use, some tools, if you will, that give us that maritime situational awareness. Long-range identification and tracking, LRIT. Now, this is more of a security issue, but it does have some safety benefits to it. It essentially allows you to know what ships are in your waters, and more importantly, what ships are approaching your waters. Automatic identification systems. This is both a safety and a security tool because it gives visibility of mariners in a maritime area as to what other ships are out there. Obviously, we want to prevent collisions. We don't want ships running into one another. We don't want ships running into, running aground or running into the dock. If you know where other ships are, you can better take actions to avoid those ships and to not get into trouble, not get into a collision situation or a situation in extremis where a collision or a grounding is almost inevitable. We have vessel traffic services. These are, in most cases, government run, but in some cases, privately run, that track where all the vessels are and let people on the vessels know where the other vessels are so that they can, again, have better situational awareness, can take action to avoid collisions, can take actions to avoid getting into a dangerous situation. We have interagency operation centers. Again, I mentioned that there are lots of different agencies that may have equities within a port area. It makes sense to have them all in the same place at the same time sharing information. Advance notice of arrivals, something else that I'd like to talk about. Advance notice of arrivals is very, very important for your situational awareness from both a safety and a security standpoint. By knowing what vessels are coming in to your maritime space, you can vet those vessels and see if they have problems from a safety or a security or a pollution standpoint. And that's one of the things that we do. We require all vessels to give us 96 hours notice of arrival, 4 days before they come into the United States. If it's less than a 4-day voyage, then they have to give us 24-hour notice of arrival. With that information, we can take a look and say, this vessel has had a lot of problems when it's come in the United States before. It is potentially a risk to the United States. Let's go ahead and take a look at that vessel before it comes in. Let's go out and board it to make sure that it doesn't have any safety problems or doesn't have any security problems or pollution problems. And if it does, we can say, as a port state, sorry, you can't come in because you pose too much of a risk to us. Let's have the next slide. Operations. The ability to take action and to do something based on the maritime domain awareness that you have. And again, with the operations ties to regimes because you have to have legal authority to take actions. So let's get to the next slide. What are some of the things that we do from an operational standpoint? Well, operations are capabilities for coordinated, in some cases collaborative, in all cases integrated actions that are taken by maritime forces that are charged with protecting the maritime space from both a safety, a security, and a stewardship point of view. You want to prevent bad people from using the space, and you want to ensure the safe use by legitimate persons who are using the space. So you want to prevent terrorists from coming in, for example, and you want to make sure that legitimate operators operate safely. So the next slide. Now, some of the things that we do from a waterway and coastal security are what we call limited access areas. Moving and fixed safety and security zones. The Coast Guard has the ability to say when, where, and under what circumstances vessels and persons can be in certain areas of the port. We create safety zones from a safety standpoint, security zones from a security standpoint. So let's say that there was a big oil spill. Well, we wouldn't want ships just barging through that oil spill because it could be very dangerous. The oil could be ignited. It could make the pollution even worse as the oil gets spread all over the place. So we might create a safety zone saying, you can't go through this area until we get the oil spill cleaned up because it's unsafe for you to do so. That safety zone may be in the water. It may be on land. Let's say you had a container facility and the container full of very dangerous hazardous cargo is being loaded or offloaded and the spreader bar fails, the container falls to the ground, it ruptures, and now you have some hazardous chemicals that have spilled all over the place. Well, that's a pretty dangerous situation. You wouldn't want people just walking right through there or taking action going in that area because it could make it worse. So you might create a safety zone, and we in the Coast Guard have that authority to create a safety zone to prevent people, trucks, activities from occurring while we try to clean up the incident. By preventing the people who don't need to be there, you're protecting them, and equally important, you're allowing the first responders, the people who have to clean up the mess, the ability to do so without being interfered with. We do the same thing from a security perspective. If you have a facility that is perhaps handling ammunition that is being loaded on board a ship that's going out to go to a conflict somewhere, we might put a security zone around that facility to prevent deliberate damage to that ammunition shipment. Safety zones largely for safety, security zones for security. But they're both limited access areas. They're both areas where we say only certain people may come in, only certain vessels, only certain things can occur within that area. Another thing that we do is something called restricted waterways or restricted navigation areas. RNAs are where we set specific conditions for navigation. We might say, for example, if the waterway is very, very narrow, we might say that there could only be one-way traffic because you don't want vessels passing. Because if vessels are passing in a very narrow waterway, you have the potential for an accident or a collision. So we may say for a vessel that's carrying liquefied natural gas, a vessel a cargo that is particularly dangerous, we might say that when liquefied natural gas vessels are coming in, only one-way traffic. only vessels can come inbound, no vessels can go outbound, or vice versa. Now, something else that we do in the United States is the approval process. There are a variety of plans or certificates or documents that vessels and facilities need in order to operate legally in ports in the United States. Security plans, pollution plans, certificates of inspection. All of these documents or these plans have to be approved. And the Coast Guard is the organization that approves those plans to make sure that they meet international requirements and to ensure that they meet the requirements of our domestic law. And it's not enough to have a plan. It's not enough to have an idea of what you're supposed to do. You got to actually do it. And that's where an inspection regime, and that, in my judgment, is probably the single most important thing that we do in the U.S. Coast Guard, is to inspect facilities and inspect vessels to ensure that whatever the legal requirement is, and it varies based on whether it's a facility or if it's a vessel, if it's a U.S. flag vessel or a foreign flag vessel, but regardless of what the requirements are, we inspect to ensure that those requirements are met. I don't know how well this translates for our Spanish-speaking colleagues, but a saying that we have in the United States is, you get what you inspect, not what you expect, which basically means that unless you inspect, unless you are exercising a measure of oversight, you are not going to get the level of safety or security that you want. And I would also tell you that that same logic applies in the private sector. If you are the port facility security officer, if you are the safety manager, if you are the environmental protection manager at your port authority or your port facility, if you're not inspecting the people who work for you, not ensuring that the people who work for you are doing their jobs, exercising that oversight, then it's a very good possibility that they won't be doing their jobs, and ultimately it's going to fall on you when the government comes and says, hey, how come your facility isn't following the laws and the regulations? So it's incumbent upon everyone at all levels to exercise that oversight. Let's have the next slide, please. Now, some of the other things that we do from an operational standpoint: manage crises. In spite of our best efforts, sometimes bad things do happen. It's very, very important to train, to practice that interagency that I talked about, to know who your interagency partners are, to work with them so that when there is a crisis, when despite all of our best efforts, something bad does happen, you're able to respond as one. Now, in the United States, we have something called the Unified Command System or Incident Command System, in which we try to have the public and the private sector working together in order to commonly address whatever the particular problem might be, whether it be a natural disaster, like a hurricane, or whether flooding, whether it be a man-made disaster like a pollution incident, or whether it be a security incident like a 9/11. Port state control is something that we do in the United States to ensure that every vessel that comes to the United States is vetted, and once it comes in the United States, is checked on a periodic basis. Recovery communications protocols. this is something that we are just starting to get into right now. But if there is a major crisis, how are you going to recover? How are you going to get the waterway, get the economy back in line? What should have priority? There's a big hurricane. All of the aids to navigation have been destroyed. We can't replace all the aids to navigation all at once. Which one should we do first? You only have one berth that's operational in your port. What should get priority? Should it be a tanker that's bringing in fuel? Should it be a cargo ship that's bringing in food? Should it be another ship that's, say, maybe bringing in medicine? It's not for us to tell you, not for me to say which is the most important, but what is important is that you have a process for the stakeholders, the emergency management folks, the operational folks, the transportation folks, to be able to sit around the table and to be able to make that decision, and then to be able to implement that decision, so that you don't have a whole bunch of arguing, well, no, that ship can't come in, we want that ship, no, not that ship, no, not that ship, that ship. And as a result, no ship comes in, and you're worse off than you are before. So you want to have these communication and recovery protocols, and you want to do it in advance so that the first time, when the incident occurs, is not the first time you've met your counterpart. Now, utilizing risk management is something I want to talk about very briefly here. We use the risk equation of threat times vulnerability times consequence is equal to risk. And the reason I talk about this is we are, from both a safety and a security standpoint, in a very target-rich environment. There are lots of things, lots of infrastructure that can have a problem. So how do you decide what infrastructure you're going to give priority to from a safety or a security or even an environmental protection standpoint? And we use this threat, vulnerability, consequence. Threat is, can be from deliberate act, but it also can be from an accident. Vulnerability is, well, okay, if something bad does happen, if the threat does materialize, excuse me, how vulnerable is the infrastructure? If something bad happens, is the infrastructure going to be destroyed? And then the consequence is, okay, if the threat occurs and the facility or the ship or whatever is vulnerable, what are the results of that? How bad does it hurt your economy, loss of life, and the environmental area? By calculating the risk, you can then decide that's more risky than that. I should pay more attention to reducing the risk over here as opposed to over there. And if I only have limited resources, it helps me make better decisions. Have the next slide. Now, from a risk management standpoint, particularly from safety, these are some of the things that you can do to try to reduce your risk. Siting. Where you have your facility can matter. Now, sometimes you don't have any control over where the facility is. But I noticed that as we've gone around the world, as countries and companies build new facilities, they site them in more remote locations so that there's less risk. If you've got an old facility that's right in the middle of the downtown, there's not a whole lot you can do about that, but that's got a lot of risk. If you can send it somewhere far away where there's not a whole lot of people around, less risk. Modifying your processes, your operational procedures, use inherently safer technologies, have fail-safe procedures. Let's say there's a fire and you've got magnetic locks. And from a safety standpoint, if there's a fire, you trip the fire alarm, the locks automatically unlock so that everybody can get out. Interagency cooperation, sharing resources, working together, private-public partnerships. Again, as we talked about, the relationship between the government and the private sector is very important. Let's have the next slide. Just a couple of concluding thoughts. and I'll wrap it up here. What do we do in the Coast Guard? Well, three things. We protect people from the sea, we protect the sea from people, and we protect our nation from threats coming from the sea. We have a unique blend of assets and statutory authorities. The statutory authorities are very, very important, that enable us to utilize both the public and the private sector. And we use risk-based decision-making to try to target our resources where they can do the most good. For example, in our port state control, we don't board every vessel every time it comes in. That would be detrimental to commerce, and we don't have the resources to do it. So what we do is we say, what vessel poses the most risk? That vessel. Okay, we're going to board that vessel. That vessel doesn't pose much of a risk to us, so we'll let that vessel come in and trade unimpeded. So, last slide, please. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you. I think we have one down there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. We got Anthony over there, and then Jean-Marie over here. To questions, please.
Hello, Mike.
Hi, how are you?
Good. You know that small vessel security is a big concern for everybody, all nations. And I know that within the last few years, the U.S. Coast Guard put out some guidelines, some information as it relates to small vessel security. Are you or the IMO, is the U.S. or the IMO any closer to developing firm regulations to govern small vessel security, seeing that it's such a challenge for port security?
I don't know about the international side. On the domestic side, that's not my area of expertise, but I think we are looking at some additional regulations. How soon or what the nature of those regulations would be, I'm not really in a position to say. I know we have a strategy and an implementation plan to address the risk that small vessels do pose, but in terms of what specifically we're doing and when it would likely to occur, I'm afraid I don't know. You're next? Okay.
Yes, and then
Okay.
Yes, sir. Good morning very much again. Curtis Denny, Antigua, Barbuda Port Authority. My question is that post 911, it was stated that there was a lack of cooperation or information sharing between the various national state agencies in the USA. And they spoke about this separation of the walls. From that experience, what mechanism or processes can you see for us in port authorities who have to interface with government, other government agencies? How can we best improve that dialogue so that the matters that relates to turf and the turf wars that we normally would have?
That's a very good question. And while it's a security-related issue as opposed to a safety-related issue, it is a good question. And I can tell you some of the things that we've done in the United States. First of all, we've done, and this really isn't my particular area of expertise, but we've done a better job of intelligence information sharing between agencies within the federal government, created new organizations, and between the state and local governments and the federal government. Now, from the private-public sector, we have these things called area maritime security committees. Remember I talked about port security committees? In the United States, we call them area maritime security committees. And members of area maritime security committees are both public sector and private sector. And in the private sector, we give or grant these individuals security clearances, certain individuals within the Area Maritime Security Committee, security clearances so they can have access to classified information, and we have a secure information exchange system. We call it Homeport. That is both a public and a private system. The public system, we post a whole bunch of things that everyone can access. The private side, though, is you're in a particular community. Let's say you were in the Port of Baltimore. well, then those members of the Area Security Committee in Baltimore would have access to a private dialogue where information could be passed. Wouldn't be available to everybody, only those people who have a need to know. So that's one of the things that we're doing, and I think the Area Maritime Security Committees really have helped that information sharing. And our home port system is that information, is a platform that we use to share that information. I think we had a question over there.
Yes, we did. Please.
Alexander from St. Lucia. In terms of what my colleague from Barbados mentioned, if vessels, non-solar vessels, those are boats are below 24 meters. I know that there's what's called the SCV code, or small commercial vessel code, and there's a committee working presently which was formed a few months ago, and I know that the U.S. Coast Guard is also on that committee. And what they did right now, they are just reestablishing the protocols as far as security for boats that are below solar size, below 24 meters, as to the ISPS requirements for them. Although international law dictates that boats that are below 24 meters are not mandated to have the ISPS or port security plan, ship security plan. However, through that committee, including the U.S. Coast Guard, they are refining plans to have those security guidelines for vessels that fall below international requirements. So I think it's an ongoing process, and there's an interim report that's due by this month end that will give guidelines with the blessings of the IMO for boats that are operating within the Caribbean region. So that's the status of that regime as far as those boats are concerned.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing on that. The way things work internationally, and a country can impose any requirements it wishes on vessels that fly its own flag, and vessels that no international standard applies to. So the United States could have said, well, the international standard doesn't apply because you're under a certain size, and since it doesn't, we're going to impose our own U.S. laws on these foreign flag vessels. That we would have been in our rights to do that. But we decided that that was not the right approach to take. So we took the vessels for which the international code did not apply, and we tried to take the features of the international code, which are not quite as strenuous and as strict as the U.S. requirements, and to try to come up with a blend of requirements that made sense for the trade and the level of risk of the vessels. Again, we're talking about that risk management that are applying between Caribbean ports and Latin American ports and the United States that are very, very small. So we recognize that it is a evolving process, a continuing process, and as technologies change, as trade patterns change, the requirements need to change as well. So we're in the process of doing that. Yeah.
Last question over there.
Hi, sir. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Jocelyn Villiers from Haiti, Port Security for Port-au-Prince Port. We learned a lot about your presentation, about security, pollution, and safety. But as a Caribbean ports, we face natural disaster almost every year. But I've heard anything about natural disaster. I would like to know, where is it fall? Is it security problem or safety problem?
Good question. It's all of the above. A natural disaster well, first of all, there's certain things you can't prevent natural disasters. I mean, if a hurricane's going to hit you, a hurricane's going to hit you. We don't have the ability to control the weather. Now, what you can do is let's go back a couple slides. because you raise a very good point. One more. Yeah, there we go. Okay. When you look at the threat, vulnerability, and consequence equation, these are some of the things that you can control. Now, the threat, it's going to be whatever it is. We're going to get a hurricane once every 5 years. You can know that based on historical information. The consequence, you know that if a hurricane does occur, it's going to be winds of 100 miles an hour. It's going to be a storm surge of 6 or 8 feet. You can control the vulnerability. And now you have to make a decision. Okay, with my facility, what can I do to reduce the vulnerability? Because the threat's going to be constant. I can't do anything about the threat. And I want to minimize my consequence. So if I reduce my vulnerability, I can reduce my consequence. So things that you might want to think about are, what are operational procedures that I can do? Do I want to say, well, you know, when the hurricane's coming, and it's going to be when it's 72 hours away, I want to evacuate the port. I want no vessels in the port. Everybody go, because if there's a vessel in the port and a big storm surge, it's going to wind up on the dock. So vessels have got to go. Maybe I might want to secure my container gantries. Or if I don't have container gantries, I just have regular cranes, maybe I might want to, as an operational procedure, say, all the cranes move inland away from the port. One of the other things that I might want to do is, okay, thinking about recovery. If I know the hurricane's going to hit, I want to make sure that whatever recovery assets I have that I'm going to be using are in a safe location. So, for example, you may recall Hurricane Katrina, the big hurricane that happened in New Orleans. Well, what the Coast Guard did was, when we said, wow, hurricane's coming, and it looks like it's going to be a really bad one, we took all of our helicopters, which we knew we were going to need, and we got them out of New Orleans. We sent them up to, I don't remember where, Shreveport or someplace where there was an airfield, 150 miles away, so that when the initial storm occurred, they were protected from the storm. Now, I know on an island you may have limited ability to protect because of the geographical features, but if there is a safe location, some kind of a secure location, the highest ground, whatever you decide based on your particular situation, you might want to pre-stage your resources, your recovery resources there, so that after the disaster occurs, you've got a safety problem, you've got a security problem, but you have your resources that you're going to use to address that problem available to be able to come online as quickly as they can. And the other thing about the recovery protocols, I'm an island. What's most important to me now that the hurricane's passed? Is it food? Is it power? Is it water? Is it getting the cruise ships back in because we have a bunch of cruise passengers that were stranded here? What? Not for me to tell you what the most important thing is for your particular circumstance, but what I would suggest to you is that you have that conversation now, or have the stakeholders who are going to make that decision know who each other are, and then if the event does occur, you're able to recover as quickly as you can.
Yes, sir. At the beginning, you said that security and safety are two faces from one coin. But at the end, you said that we need security plan, but also pollution plans. What about the safety one? How to address it?
Well, from a safety standpoint, in the United States, well, I didn't mention this, but we have multiple plans. Vessels, we have security plans for vessels and facilities. We have pollution plans for facilities. We have a national response plan. We have in most facilities and all government agencies have contingency plans that are basically disaster preparedness plans or safety plans. We don't really have the requirement for specific safety, a general safety plan like we do as the ISPS code for a facility security plan. However, we have such a large body of safety regulations and requirements already that a specific safety plan isn't needed. You just need to be in compliance with the myriad of state and local safety requirements and safety laws and safety regulations. But we do require contingency plans for natural disasters. So that's something that all facilities and all governments have.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much for your questions. I think that, again, my opinion is that these questions are the ones that really enrich the experience for the audience as we get to ask from our presenters, you know, those questions that are more pressing to us. Before we end and we're going to have a really quick break, I bid everyone to please you know, go get a cup of coffee, a quick bathroom break, whatnot, because we're quite late, and our next speaker has some time constraints. So I'd be very, very grateful if we can just do this coffee break as expeditious as possible. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you one last thing that perhaps could exemplify for us, especially the port directors here. You mentioned local committees. And out of the whole thing, I think that this is something we can take with us because we can all do that. Mm-hmm. We can all put local committees of public and private institutions, NGOs, and put the relevant stakeholders, that you said, in order to avoid conflict, create consensus, synergies, and then plan and take this. Could you give us a specific example of a local committee, if you have one in mind, so that we may better know how these local committees are made up? And perhaps from there we can extrapolate to our own circumstances. And after that, we'll let you go.
Okay, well, the specific example is in all ports in the United States, we have what are called area maritime security committees. And so every port has one. I know that many countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America have local committees, but I don't know which ones are which. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I can look it up and we can find out which ones do have local committees if you're interested in that. But I would tell you this, if you're interested in following up on that, for those of you who are aware, we have individuals called International Port Security Liaison Officers, or IPSLOs. They're based for Latin America, for the Caribbean, they're based out of our office in Portsmouth, Virginia. For the East Coast, most of the East Coast of Latin America, they're based out of our, also out of our Portsmouth office. For the West Coast of Latin America and for Central America, they're based out of our office in Alameda, California. And they are a good point of contact for you if you have some specific questions about what countries do have area committees or port security committees. They would be a good source, and they could probably give you the answer right off the top of their head, because each one of these liaison officers has a portfolio of countries that they are responsible for. So if you're from Belize, then you would talk to your liaison officer, and he or she could say, oh, yeah, your neighbor next down the street has one, or not. So
again, thank you very much, and we'll just take a quick break and be right back.
Okay, thank you.
This is for you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Hopefully, I talked with my guys yesterday, and they were locked and loaded, so they should be here this afternoon.
Dude, we're gonna have you more often. You were a great speaker. You're open. You're clear. You're pause and explanations. I think you're great. I think.
It's kind of you to say that.
You know, it's not like you've done it before, so.
Yeah, we can't have any of that here. We can't have good speakers. We can't have people that are. Are you interested?
Oh, I'm sorry, because I'm ambassador. This whole time I thought you guys knew each other. So I'm talking to him and I'm talking to you and we go way back.
There was Lonnie, and there was another guy who was down in Cartagena. I can't remember.
Oh, Tom, but he's been moved to.